Welcome to our closing plenary, everyone. Thanks to those who have joined us for both days, or if you could only pop in to today. We're feeling really overwhelmed, I guess, by the quality of the 2 days and inspired by not just speakers here on this soil, but of course, we've witnessed as well amazing solidarity internationally that has really got us fired up in our homes, on Twitter, on Instagram, and most definitely I popped in and out of the Slack. So loving the chats going on in there as well. We're just going to wrap this up and give our kind of closing remarks. I think from my perspective, this really, was a little idea that was planted in my head by perhaps probably the other co-organisers here who had witnessed RebLaw conferences overseas and trying to galvanise our minds to bring something here to Australia. And in thinking about where we start with rebellious lawyering on this continent, in my view, it does begin and end with First Nations as the first lawmakers. And it has really got us thinking about the unfinished business here in this country and grappling with our roles as lawyers and whether or not challenging if we are either on the one hand enabling colonisation or disrupting and dismantling colonisation. There has been so many themes discussed and I have had the privilege to both talk with and listen to, in particular, First Nations women who have been at the forefront of a lot of movement lawyering here in Australia and rebellious lawyering, not because they either one understood the theory, but necessarily, the work getting done here has been out of necessity. We have been so fortunate to have, and that was part of my involvement with this conference, was ensuring that the narrative around this kind of work had elevated the work that was being done, not just now in the moment, but in history, of the load that First Nations women have carried on this continent. One of the themes that really stood out for me, really from, things of what Professor Davis was saying about ethical loneliness and Australia's listening but not hearing of First Nations. Also, Professor Larissa Brandt, who discussed, this notion of when working with communities, this radical idea of First Nations communities being, I guess, viewed as loving their children. And then, how is that a radical idea in this country that is so wealthy that simply does not understand the dignity or recognise the dignity inherent with First Nations peoples? And I think I felt a bit overwhelmed and tipped over the edge today in our climate justice talk when we heard from both Fleur and Marawa on their work and their activism, and also their storytelling around climate justice within First Nations communities. And none of those things are in fact radical, but in Australia, the work being done, particularly by First Nations women, is considered radical, and that comes with it tension, and I think as well a lot of energy getting used when we are stepping up to the plate. And I think there were some non-Indigenous speakers as well, particularly Deb Kilroy, emphasised if you're a non-Indigenous lawyer, it is your role to create space and step up and in front of people of colour to protect from things like white supremacy. And so it brings me back to the privilege of being involved in organising this conference for over a year. To the 4 other co-organisers who are not Indigenous but had stepped up and created space for this conversation, and in particular for it to be led by First Nations women and people of colour. I think if we look over the last 2 days, that radical lawyering, the rebellious lawyering, and these ideas of storytelling have been led in particular by First Nations peoples and people of colour. And it's about now, I guess, how non-Indigenous lawyers and people space of movement lawyering, creating spaces for people to tell their own stories. And so I think with that being said, as perhaps the last thing I would want to leave with is probably something said on the climate justice panel today by one of the First Nations women was, we are in fact tired. And so it really is the role of the community here that we have created in hoping to go forward, that really this is just the beginning of exposing the kind of work that needs to be done here on the lands and waters of First Nations that have never ceded sovereignty. And it really, I think, hones home into how much work as lawyers we must get done, and also stepping into and working with communities. So with that being said, I want to leave you all with, I guess, the words of the other co-organisers. Thank you all for joining us. In terms of some of the work that I have been doing, I should say, and I guess the last panel as well. The last panel spoke about funding and the differences with the Australian context and international context. And with the work that I have done, both with things like the Uluru Statement from the Heart, or also the Wallama Court, for example, that I've worked on since 2016, trying to fight for systemic changes. These are spaces in which, you know, they're done entirely voluntary on my behalf. They've been the types of work and systemic changes that I have done, I guess, on my personal capacity on top of a full-time job. And I think we really need to think about what the takeaways are in the last panel around funding these, and how we, I guess, galvanise a community and step up and create education in philanthropic spaces, but also accountability within governments in delivering where they're supposed to be delivering services as well. So with that being said, I think it's quite obvious so much work needs to be done, but also outside the area of law, so much healing needs to be done in our society. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my co-organisers, Susan.
Thank you so much, Teela. That was a great summing up of some of the themes and some of the work that we need to do. And I guess this session is about really opening up a discussion about how we organise in our personal lives and amongst ourselves to empower movements and communities. Throughout the conference, we've focused on the theme of shifting power and how we as lawyers have a responsibility to change how we practice law so as to build the long-term power of impacted communities and movements. And in Australia, it's how we step up and support First Nations people. This session is really an opportunity for us to think about and make a commitment together to implement some of what we've learned as we continue our work. It's also an opportunity for you to help us determine the future of the RebLaw conference and how it can be used to continue to foster this community of rebellious lawyers. Looking back at the conference, I guess we wanted to ask you about what are some of the themes that you can express in a single word. So again, we'll pull up the QR code that you can scan or go to slido.com and enter the code that's on the screen. And let us know what are some of the themes from the conference that you can express in a single word that really stood out to you. Yeah, listening was a big one. So interesting to see power, accountability, humility, community, absolutely. I guess one thing that really stood out to me was also listening, and we were all going to share one rebellious idea from the conference that has really kind of inspired us and given us hope for the future. And I think my rebellious idea, which is probably not that rebellious, and really comes from what Vince Warren said and what Professor Megan Davis said, was just around the power of silence and actually listening to hear, and not just paying lip service and saying we're listening. So staying silent in those moments and letting those communities that are most impacted do the talking and do the leading. Teela, would you like to share one of your rebellious ideas that have kind of given you hope coming out of the conference?
It's weird because I don't think it's rebellious, but I do think it's important. And I think it's this notion of ensuring that we elevate storytelling and stories. And as lawyers, you know, we're often stuck in this, I think, narrow legal framework of how we are told that stories must be delivered and told, and, you know, things like affidavits or from the witness box. But in fact, when it comes to storytelling, First Nations are the original storytellers. And I think elevating the importance of oral storytelling and how that plays out in our society is so important. And it is rebellious because for so long, you know, the Western world has placed value on and emphasized the importance of the ways in which we must tell a story. You know, for example, in school, it's kind of like reading a novel or it's writing an essay. But in fact, First Nations stories come from the land, and these are inherently valuable and they have moral force and significance. And at the, you know, most fundamental level of oral storytelling in First Nations communities is that these oral stories are our laws. And so I think it's really bringing to the surface and elevating in our society the importance of oral storytelling within First Nations.
Thank you. Brooke, would you like to share a rebellious idea?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's so many, and it's so lovely to see all the sort of words popping up on the screen there, and to see so many people kind of reflect the ideas of the conference. But I guess one idea that's really stuck out to me is from Vince Warren's keynote on the first day, and also from our international panel this morning, just this idea of international solidarity. And it's about not just learning what we have to learn from people in other countries and overseas, but recognising that the systems of oppression are actually global. We're dealing with colonisation, with injustices against people of colour all over the world, and we're in this fight together. And I love taking that concept away.
Thank you so much. And Sarah, would you like to share with everyone one rebellious idea that's given you hope?
Yeah, I think one thing which really has stood out to me and that I've been thinking about along the conference is this idea of discomfort that a few of the speakers mentioned. And I think that there's sort of this discomfort in two senses. First, first this idea of like grappling with the discomfort and tension between the law as this conservative, you know, tool of oppression, as Brooke said, and the demands of communities and movements. And I really loved what Vince said about being prepared to be uncomfortable with the demands that communities are making on power. And I think that that also really ties in with what Nora and Marbury and Alejandra said on the international panel about the law being this tool of oppression around the world. And what Nora said about the language of the law, like using the language of the law as being deferential to a racist framework. And that's really the antithesis of what movements strive for. And Debbie Kilroy and Alison Whitaker also really spoke about the power and violence and the language of the law in upholding carceral, racist, violent systems, the way that, you know, terms like justice and corrections are weaponized. And spoke about the law as this side of struggle. And so that's really a tension that I think that we have to grapple with as lawyers, and that, you know, is hard to grapple with as lawyers that we're working within this system. And there's this inherent discomfort. And I think the second type of discomfort is what Megan and Larissa both spoke about, being willing to be a little bit ostracized within a conservative legal profession, and being willing to step up. And I think Professor Megan Davis said it really powerfully when she said we need to be prepared to be unpopular, to be chastised, and still to step up. And as Larissa said, we need to step up but also step aside. So that really resonated with me.
Aren't just on an individual level either. I think as a nation, we need to step up and engage in this discomfort. And when I say that, I think, you know, it comes to something perhaps Marawa said today, which is about the fundamental grievances of this nation. And stepping up and into that discomfort means perhaps, yes, you feel it on an individual level, but you have to engage with it on a national scale. And so while we are still kind of self-reflecting as lawyers and our roles in movements and how we, you know, wait for the call to be engaged in spaces and community levels, I think that there is this other layer that people spoke about as well, which is what Marbury spoke about in terms of this is the language of the law, and our gift and our privilege is knowing that language. And in fact, sometimes we don't have to wait to articulate that. And so when we're talking about discomfort, I mean, you have to realize every time a First Nations person walks out the door in the day, we're feeling that anxiety every day and that discomfort every day, because it's a society that is not made for us. And while you might step in and out of it in your privilege as a lawyer from 9 to 5, we don't have that luxury of walking away from it. So when we talk about discomfort, I think that we need to engage in ways perhaps in what Professor Davis said, which, yes, have the discomfort, like the uncomfortable conversations, do it in respectful ways. But I think we have to take it to a new level. We have to take it up and to a national scale, because there are fundamental grievances here that this country hasn't dealt with. And ultimately, that's the sovereignty of First Nations. And that's going to make a lot of people walking on these sovereign First Nations lands very uncomfortable. And our role as lawyers, I think, is huge in that.
Yeah, absolutely, Teela. You're 100% right. I think being uncomfortable is not just an individual exercise, it's for this nation to reckon with. And I might hand it over to Zoe for her rebellious idea, and we'll leave it to you to kind of talk about some of the themes of the conference.
Awesome, and I think, yeah, totally. And continuing on from, you know, what Teela was saying and the role of lawyers in, you know, that national conversation about, you know, the origin of this country, the genesis of Australia as we know it today, and reckoning with that history. I think one of the sort of key ideas really grappled with, and I think it first came up today in the context of the global approaches to movement lawyering session with Marbury and Noura, we're talking about, you know, law isn't going to be the site of our liberation. You know, like at best it promises a contest and it promises a battle, and what determines the outcome of that contest and battle is, you know, the power outside of it, you know, where the balance of power is outside of the law, and that's dictated by things like movements and stuff. And, you know, and I really love this idea that Marbury talked about, and then it was picked up again in the funding session by Liv and I think even Jen, you know, this idea of actually, like, our job as lawyers working in this space is to, like, work ourselves out of a job, you know, like we will have achieved our aim when, you know, whether, you know, for me, it's climate change, for, you know, other co-organisers, it's other issues, and for Sarah, it's around prison. It's, you know, we will have achieved our job and the outcome that the communities we represent seek when we don't have a job to do anymore. So, you know, I think that's a really, to keep that in mind is a really, yeah, it's a really different way of thinking about our jobs in these spaces. And so, you know, and so like taking these ideas that we've all just reflected on and that have come up throughout the conference, you know, and this is a discussion that came up a bit in some of the breakout rooms during the last 2 days, is how on earth do we translate all of these ideas into action? You know, how do we translate it into our everyday practice as lawyers? It can seem so far, you know, sort of pie in the sky ideas compared to the day-to-day of practicing law. And we wanted to perhaps, if we could go to the next slide, thank you, with our amazing tech team, with these 5, and we find these 5 questions from Professor Bill Quigley really helpful for sort of critically reflecting on, you know, on how we integrate all these principles of movement lawyering into our daily practice and what that looks like. And you know, so the first one is, you know, where does the direction for the lawyering come from? And I feel like this is particularly a theme on the first day. It's like this idea of, you know, is it lawyers who are setting the agenda and driving their own agenda and sort of coming up with case ideas and then imposing it on communities, or is it coming from communities themselves? Are we doing what Vince Warren talked about, where we embed ourselves in community and shut up and listen and are directed by them, or sort of a co-design process like Marawa was talking about in relation to the Waratah Coal Challenge. So where does the direction for lawyering come from? Where does the power go? You know, does the work just reinforce this societal idea of lawyers as particularly entitled and like privileged to solve other people's problems for them, and just entrench this idea of them as heroes and privileged, or does it seek to redistribute unjust power relationships and actually transfer power to those who've been historically disempowered? Who gets the glories? You know, is it lawyers who are soaking up all the media opportunities, who are getting all the praise, or is it, you know, those that we're working with, those who are directly impacted? Is the legal work just one part of the overall social change movement? I think, you know, this is obviously something we explored in quite a bit of detail at the advocacy session at the end of yesterday, and the need for whether it's litigation or whatever other form the legal work might take, to be situated within like a broader change movement that's, you know, really grounded in organising efforts and has a media and comms strategy attached to it as well. And you know, this idea that, you know, even if, and I think that maybe it was Rodney that talked about this idea of success has to be about, our definition of success, a successful outcome has to be about changing hearts and minds, because any legal or policy victory can be undone so quickly if we haven't achieved that, you know, so that need for that legal work to be situated in that broader effort. And finally, is a lawyer, I promise we didn't write these questions subsequent to the conference happening. I feel like we're just repeating a lot of the themes that people have been saying. These existed before, but is a lawyer willing to be uncomfortable on some sort of regular basis? And I won't rehash it. We've just talked a lot. Sarah just elaborated a lot on how that's come up as a theme throughout the conference. So, you know, I think that we find these 5 questions, I find these 5 questions really helpful for stepping back from the granularity of sort of like my day-to-day practice as a lawyer, and, you know, critically reflecting on how the work I do is situated within those broader efforts and sort of integrates those principles of movement lawyering.
Thanks so much, Zoe. And I think that really ties in with the next thing that we want to discuss in this closing is where to from here. You know, we've heard from so many amazing people about, you know, how we can think about implementing, you know, these themes and what we've heard about in our day-to-day work. But we had a pretty ambitious goal when we came together to organise this conference. You know, we really spoke about transforming the legal profession, and that is just not something that we can do as individuals. Part of what we set out to do and what we would love to do is use this conference to build a community. And I know that a lot of people spoke about that in their breakout rooms as well, about, you know, wanting to have a network for progressive lawyering, for movement lawyers, and to organise and be able to work better with communities. We really hope that this conference can serve as a springboard for organising within the profession, for both critical reflection on our role as lawyers, but also for holding each other accountable to the communities and movements that we work with, and for fostering a space within a really conservative legal profession for those who are committed to building the long-term power of communities and movements for change. And it's not up to us to dictate the ways that we forge this network. We're really committed to building this space as an inclusive, welcoming and imaginative space. Some ideas that we have for the future include, first, for staying connected. We're hoping to have a future in-person conference when borders open up. Apparently in WA, that's only going to happen in September 2022. So we want to create either in-person spaces or hybrid spaces where people can meet and share ideas and build really meaningful connections. The second thing is for remaining critical and building power. We have been thinking around ideas about having in-person or online spaces such as webinars, local meetings, where lawyers and organisers can share case studies of their work for critical reflection and share learnings with each other. And for continuing to learn ideas like a RebLaw book club, a podcast, a place where we can share resources, online and in-person courses, and partnering with academics and universities, and most importantly, communities, to create educational materials. Those are just some ideas, but we really want your feedback on what you want us to do next. What is going to be most helpful to you and what is going to be most motivating and will enable us to really organise as a profession. We've sent, and you might have already received it, an email from RebLaw, which is has a feedback survey, and the feedback survey will be about, you know, how you think we should organise for the future. I'll also post a link to that in the Slack so you can contribute, and then we'll get back in touch after the conference to share that feedback and bring more people into this organising space. In the meantime, we've got social media accounts. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram, tag us, save us in photos, and just continue the conversation.
Thanks, Sarah. And like Sarah said, we are trying to build a community and we can't do this alone. And it's really important that we recognise that we actually haven't been alone in bringing this conference to life. There's been so many people who've backed us along the way, and we just want to recognise and mention a few of them. First, to Jen Robinson, who's given us advice and guidance and enthusiastic support right from the beginning. To artist Rachel Sara, who designed our really amazing logo that we have used so much in the process of organising. And Jim Bob, who donated the Black Lives Matter Perth photo that's been everywhere on our slides and our website, which is an incredible shot. To the Australian Centre for International Justice, and particularly to Rowan, who spoke on the advocacy panel last night, for generously agreeing to auspice us and for offering continual encouragement throughout. For the Redback team, who did our amazing website, Mel and Dave in particular. To Justice Connect and Hive lawyers for the legal assistance they provided. And then critically to our speakers and specifically to Riverbank Front, who opened our conference yesterday. And it's a real reminder of just how important our First Nations elders are. And like Teela said at the beginning of this closing plenary, that it begins and ends there with them. And also really want to do a big shout out to our terrific volunteers who have done an amazing job of facilitating the breakout rooms, helping us with social media, helping us with the Slack channels, just an incredible group of people that we feel so privileged to have join us. And finally, and it really particularly, we want to thank the tech team from King and Wood Mallisons that have been behind the scenes for this entire 2 days and have actually provided days and days of their time and effort helping us to get this conference together and to make it professional. We really could not have done it without them, and they are incredible. So when we first started this conference over a year ago, it was just the 5 of us. And this project in and of itself has been an exercise in what we can do collectively when we put our minds together. We're pretty determined that it won't end here, as you've heard, and it makes a real difference that each of you tuning in today has made the time and space to be here. And it will make a difference if all of us take 1 or 2 of the things we've learned into our work and lives. So thank you all for attending. We hope to see you again soon.